So when we're talking about child support and spousal support, and parties are a very limited means, which may be some of the clients that you come into contact with, it's important to know that child support takes priority over spousal support. So for example, even if someone is entitled to both spousal support and child support, but the parties are low income, it may be the case that there's simply not enough money to go around to meet both the spousal support and child support obligations. So in some scenarios, we see only child support being paid, even though the person has a strong entitlement to spousal support as well, because that's what the family can afford. And I also just want to mention that this is often one of the hardest pills for clients to swallow when they come in my office, the idea that they have to make monthly payments to their ex-spouse for their support is not something that people are super excited about. But it's important to remind people that the way that they structure their roles and responsibilities during the marriage can often mean that one person is in a way better position to earn income to support themselves after the relationship ends than the other person. So a situation that we often see is somebody who left the workforce in order to care for the children, and it's often the wife. Meanwhile, husband is going off and developing his career and making advancements and getting raises, and the wife's career is basically forestalled because they've made a decision together as a couple that she'll stay home with the kids, and it's not fair that when a relationship ends, that the wife should be in a position where she doesn't have any support because of decisions that were made during the relationship. So unlike child support, spousal support is not automatic. You have to prove that you're entitled to it, and you have to meet the definition of a spouse in order to seek spousal support. So remember I mentioned that 2-year period that you have to be living in a marriage-like relationship in order to be spouses. So if you have been living together for less than 2 years, you're not entitled to spousal support, but the exception is if you have a child together. The objectives of spousal support are set out in the Divorce Act. So this is what we're hoping spousal support is going to achieve for people. We're hoping that it will recognize the financial advantages and disadvantages that a spouse will face from the relationship or separation, that it will reduce economic hardship. So that's basically saying that it will allow each spouse to be able to meet their financial needs, share the financial burden of consequences to caring for the children during the relationship. So this is one that comes into play a lot when people have been living together for less than 2 years, but they have a child, and to help spouses be financially independent. Spousal support is very important for people because as anyone who is divorced or knows someone who's going through divorce may know, 2 households are a lot more expensive to run than 1. And parties who are separating are often facing a large financial burden of paying an additional rent, furnishing their house with additional furniture, and only being able to survive on 1 income. So spousal support is very important to ensure that people aren't just left in the lurch financially after a separation. So there's 3 bases for entitlement to spousal support. First I'll talk about contractual. So spouses have agreed that spousal support is payable, and you might see this in a marriage agreement, like a prenup, or a cohabitation agreement, or a separation agreement that sets out this amount of spousal support will be payable if we separate, or we have separated and we have agreed that spousal support will be this. But most people, I would say, don't have these agreements in place. So the entitlement basis that they're going to be relying on are needs-based or compensatory. So needs-based is when a spouse has financial need. They simply have expenses that are higher than their ability to meet that need, and the other spouse has a higher income and they're able to pay spousal support to meet the need. And compensatory is where it's a little bit trickier because you don't just look at the spouse's financial situation right after separation. You actually have to look back over the history of the relationship. So compensatory is when a spouse suffered an economic loss or hardship as a result of the relationship or breakdown. So a situation that would fall into that is the one I talked about before, where mom stayed at home watching the kids. She didn't advance her career, and dad was able to do that. Sometimes we see a situation where the other spouse gained an advantage to the detriment of the other spouse's career. So for example, that could mean you're married and you're working and you're helping to put your spouse through school, and now they have a medical degree, and maybe you weren't able to advance your career as much because a lot of your income was going to support them and their tuition. So with the compensatory basis, it can be a little bit harder to prove exactly all the ins and outs of what went on during the spouse's relationship, who was actually at home caring for the kids. So we see a lot of that come out in detailed affidavit evidence, but it's often contested. Someone will say, we both decided that I was going to stay home and care for the kids. And then the other person will say, no, I was always pushing her to go and find a job, and she just didn't want to. She's lazy or whatever. So it's sometimes hard to prove a compensatory basis to spousal support. But the good news is that in the interim, before trial, courts are generally willing to order spousal support even when a spouse can't necessarily prove exactly all of the elements of it, or even where there's a lot of conflicting evidence, because they want people to be in a position where they're supported before the matter gets resolved, which can often take a really long time. It can take, up to a year to set a trial date, and if someone is not receiving spousal support for that entire period, it can be very difficult for them to manage their own affairs, much less afford a lawyer to help them resolve their dispute. So that's entitlement. So talking about amount and duration. So there are certain factors the court will look at. They'll look at the length of time the spouses were together, the role that each spouse played in the relationship, and if there's an order or agreement for spousal support. So determining the amount of spousal support is very different than determining the amount of child support. Child support, you go to the guidelines, you punch in the information, it spits out a number, that's your child support. Spousal support calculations are a little more tricky. There is a service online, mysupportcalculator.ca, where you can direct clients to help them get a very rough spousal support calculation. But generally, you need a special software to provide accurate numbers for spousal support, because there's so many factors that you put in to the calculation. So you put in the age, you put in the length of the relationship, you put in the incomes of the parties, you put in the special expenses that are being paid. There's a lot of factors that it's a very complex calculation, and there's a lot of factors that you need to put in order to get an accurate result. But generally, there's the calculation software that we use will put out a range of numbers and will give a sense of a duration. So usually there's a low range, a high range, and a mid-range. Parties, when they're negotiating, generally tend to go with the mid-range because it's just easier to pick a middle amount to agree on. It sometimes helps reduce conflict to go with that amount. But someone may have a ground to claim the high range of spousal support if they were particularly disadvantaged in the marriage. So for example, if they were caring for a disabled child during the marriage, we just had this situation, and they weren't able to work at all, then they may say, I'm entitled to the high range of spousal support because that is appropriate to compensate me for the disadvantages that I suffered because of the relationship. Okay? It's possible to, similar to child support, although I didn't mention this before, it's possible to change an order or an agreement for spousal support if there has been a material change of circumstances that didn't exist when the order or agreement was made. So material change of circumstances is a legal term. But generally, for spousal support, what you often see people arguing is, so for recipients, they may say they want to change spousal support if spousal support payments are going to end. They were only set for 5 years, and the end date is coming up, but their financial situation hasn't improved, or if their financial situation has actually gotten worse, and they need more support than they did before. Or if something unexpected happened, like they became ill, they maybe got in a car crash and they can't work anymore, then they may argue for spousal support to be extended or reviewed so that they can continue to be supported. The purpose of spousal support is for spouses to become self-sufficient. Often, I mean, sometimes that's not always possible if things happen that you can't expect, but it's important for people who are receiving spousal support to know that this isn't just a supplement to their income that they can live off forever. They still have a duty, because they're no longer in a relationship, to go out and get retrained, maybe, seek more education if that's appropriate, but try to re-enter the workforce, even though it is difficult sometimes for people. But they do have an obligation to try to become self-sufficient, and the court will look at whether someone is trying to become self-sufficient in ordering spousal support. So are they applying for jobs? Are they updating their resume? Are they trying to get skills so that they can get to a place where they don't need to be supported forever?